member of the Ways and Means Committee. But Hugh Carey, at that time, was very much loved by other members of the Congress and respected by them. And I could stop by his office, and in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes, he'd have me 5 of the best appointments you could ever make in Washington to make my pitch on behalf of New York State. And he was doing that really as a representative of a district, but even then he had some sense of our whole state and our whole state needs. And so when he was elected governor, it was sort of my having known him earlier in the days in the Congress, transitioning with him, but he had that basic care and concern. It was there, but hidden. And I say hidden, he didn't show it in the public view.
Good. Joya had something along those lines, you know, and put it differently. So, but see, when you put these things together, you're going to have a better appreciation of the things that, you know, that people would be reluctant to talk about in this, you know.
At the risk of this not being right, let him run something, and this would be something you could take in or out.
We're going to do a little more.
Just, if he's got it.
Oh yeah, we've got it.
It may be something Hugh Carey doesn't.
Okay.
You know, in those days of going to Washington, you know, to lobby for the people of our state and trying to obtain more money for state programs from the federal government, I sort of got to know Hugh Carey as a member of the Congress. And my wife Pat and I were fortunate in that period. You know, we casually got to know and meet the governor and his wife Helen. And Hugh Carey was a very warm and caring person. You could see it then. Of course, large family, a happy home life, one that he enjoyed. And I remember shortly after the inauguration in '75, being at a party at the mansion and observing Hugh Carey really alone. And here was a man who, you know, in spite of all the children, and many of them with him in the mansion, you could sense there a loss. And, you know, Pat and I observed that, you know, here was a man devoted to his wife. At the time that, I'll say, he emerged into in a very successful way, being elected to as governor of our state, but the one to whom it probably meant the most to share it wasn't there with him. And I think some of the public image, the toughness that he maybe took on at that time, was more of a protective one that he didn't want to show in public some of the, you know, the deep concerns and cares. And I think it related to the loss of his wife at that time and the loss of 2 children just before that period. And so that maybe that caring Hugh Carey didn't show because he really didn't want to show it.
Mm-hmm. That's nice.
Okay.
All right.
A couple seconds.
From where you sat and maybe even where you sit now, looking back just a little bit, what do you think over the 2 terms that Hugh Carey spent in the governor's chair in Albany was his contribution first to the people of the state of New York and then the state sort of in general?
The greatest contribution, I think, that I would identify has to do with the fact that the governor understands some of the basic needs of the citizens who live here in New York State. He really does know that almost every family at some point in time faces serious problems, and he values the kinds of services that government can render under those circumstances. He's a man who doesn't go for slogans, who has a very real understanding of what's needed for children to grow, what's needed to help family members sustain one another. And he has an extraordinary understanding of how the economic conditions relate to the needs of our citizens. I think the thing that I admire about him most is the fact that while he was focused on the economic problems and creating a better environment here for business in New York State, he always saw the interrelationship of that to the service needs, the human service needs of our citizens. And I think he's rather unique as an elected official in that regard.
I'm going to move you up just a bit here because you are typically soft-spoken. You have now left state government, and you've been in the private sector for a little while, and whatever you might be doing down the road, let's say maybe 2 or 3 years, and there is a moment of reflection, and you think about Hugh Carey, what's the first thing that will sort of percolate to the surface? What are you going to remember first?
Oh, I would always remember his leadership in relation to disabled persons. One of our children is very disabled. He's now 28 years old. And it was Hugh Carey in Congress who first carried the case for the educational needs of youngsters who are handicapped. But he never forgot that. He's a man of principle. And I will always remember, I think, that an individual like Hugh Carey can make an enormous difference. If he had not been in there fighting early, I believe that services for the handicapped and disabled would have lagged many, many years behind where we are now. So I suppose that I will always remember the leadership quality, the intellect that was strong enough to make the case. And I think we've just all been very fortunate to be able to work with a man of that caliber.
What more need be said?
You want me to look into that thing, or look at you, or just look at you?
That's the signal to start. From where you served in the Carey administration, and from where you sit now, looking back over his 2 terms and his 8 years in office, what is your sort of nugget of truth insofar as his contribution, governor's contribution to the people and then the state?
Well, I think certainly for me it would have to be economic development, cutting taxes, cutting the overhead of government, cutting the burden of regulations, providing incentives for business. Those things which produced 500,000 new jobs for people in the private sector, which meant we influenced at least 500,000 families in the state of New York by giving them a job and the wherewithal to make their own way.
I've heard from other people before that Hugh Carey had the guts, I guess, to put somebody in a job and give them some very broad guidelines, but then let them go. What was your experience?
Well, I think my experience with the governor would be that who else but Hugh Carey would have had nerve enough to trust a 34-year-old kid who had this crazy idea that if we went from $400,000 budget for travel advertising to $4,400,000, we could have an I Love New York campaign. I don't think anybody but him would have trusted a young kid like me with that kind of a job.
A couple of years down the road, maybe more than a couple of years down the road, when history begins to look at Hugh Carey, and maybe an item in the paper perks your remembrance of him, what's going to come to the surface first for you?
Well, I think that it was a special time for me personally, but a special time for the state of New York. That here was a man that had the guts to face the hardest problems, did it with good cheer and with amusement, and did it with a sort of an Irish style to things, and in the end did an awful lot to make New York State ready to face the next 30 or 40 years, and tidied up a lot of due bills that other governors had left to him and didn't have courage enough to deal with.
If Hugh Carey had not been elected in 1974 and sat in office in these 2 terms, where would New York State be, do you think?
I think we would be in a very difficult position. I don't see where either of the people he ran against would have had the talent or the determination or the courage to face the problems New York had in a very difficult period of readjusting from the always rich empire state that nobody could come anywhere near competing with, to a state that had a lot of structural problems in its economy and its workforce, and had to deal with a new era. And he will be the transitional figure, in my opinion, between the old era of the empire state, which always had more money than it knew what to do with, to the new empire state, which is going to have to compete with everybody else on its own footing.
In your career as a state official, you were dubbed sometimes a maverick. Did anything ever come up between you and Hugh Carey relative to your sort of colorful image?
Oh yeah, we had a lot of discussions about some of the escapades that I guess I was more well known for. He seemed to have two reactions. One was that he really wished he could do that himself, because there were a lot of people, particularly in the legislature, he wished he could say those same things to, but couldn't. So I think he enjoyed vicariously that some of the things I did. Others he thought really I would have been better off if I hadn't done, and he made that very clear to me too.
Okay. So why don't we try and see what happens. Basil, you've left state government and have some retrospect now because you're away from it a little bit, but not that long. But from where you sat in state government and where you sit now, what is your appreciation of Hugh Carey's contribution, first to the people of the state of New York and then to the state in general?
Well, I think there are some things that were very noteworthy about the Carey administration. I think if you spoke to anybody in the public, they would talk about his courage. Not just the death penalty, but everything. He was a man who stuck to his principles. Fiscal stability was his hallmark, and yet he had a concern and compassion for those most in need in our society. The handicapped, the poor, the elderly, the very young, blacks, Hispanics, probably always found him ready to listen and prepared to act. So I will always think about that. And on a personal note, I suppose, being Secretary of State and dealing with a man who was my chief and yet allowed me to run my department almost totally unfettered. Aside from the budget problems that always came up, you discussed those, you negotiated them out, he gave that sense of the buck stops here. It's your responsibility. He called that management by objective, and I found by speaking with other commissioners that they all had the same inspiration. It's my job, he's allowing me to do it my way, and it brings out the very best in one. And I think it heightened our responsiveness, probably improved our efficiency, and clearly made for greater effectiveness. He challenged you to do your job. It's something that I hope that I will be doing at any time when I have people working under me.
Now let's go 5, 6, 8, 10 years down the road, and let's say a little item in the paper shows up, and Hugh Carey's name is mentioned, and you think back. What's the first thing that's going to come to the surface for you in your remembrance of Hugh Carey?
I think that will probably be determined by so many other things that we can't foresee. I think something has already happened as an historical perspective we can maintain right now. An election has occurred with an apparent desire on the part of the nation at large to see some modification of the national administration's direction. I look back and realize that Hugh Carey was one of the few men in public life, one of the few persons in public life, who maintained and forthrightly maintained a progressive philosophy. He didn't back away from it. And at a time when other people are saying we've got to abandon our long-held principles, there's something wrong with the principles of progressiveness, he stood by them. He recognized in a period of near-record unemployment, near-record rate of business failures, and a heightened suspicion of the national administration, someone had to stand up. I think if you look at him 5 years hence as a historian and you examine the record, you say this man was a great governor, and his administration was one of the finest the state has ever enjoyed. How he will look historically on a personal basis, we have to see what happens with him, what his stance will be on major issues, because Hugh Carey isn't a man who will end his term and retire. He's an activist by nature. I go a long way back with him. We went to law school together, so we're always kidding. We knew each other long before I knew my wife, and I've been married a long time now. He's always been that kind of a person, involved, speaking up. He will be that kind of a person, and I think our view of him, to a large extent, will be somewhat fashioned by the things he's saying and the things he's doing down the road. But for those who are serious students of history, they're going to look at his administration and see the fiscal stability and the compassion and concern he exhibited at the same time. They're going to say this was a great administration.
Okay.
I'm sure it won't be as heavy as all of that.
Well, no, I mean, there's a recently departed bureaucrat who had all that kind of horseshit, you know, ready. Okay. Remembering your service in state government as secretary to the governor, and then watching state government from the private sector, what is sort of your nugget of truth, if you will, about Hugh Carey's contribution, first to the people of the state of New York, and then the state generally?
Yeah. I don't know if you can divide the contribution to the people and to the state generally. My memory always goes back to the crisis, to the fiscal crisis, because that's when Hugh Carey and I were thrown together as two people who really didn't know each other at first, and taking over a government that for 16 years had been in the hands of others, and a statewide bureaucracy that we didn't feel was totally responsive to us, and for good reason. After 16 years, it's very, very difficult for that kind of a change to take place. And when in the midst of something like that, you come upon a crisis of the extent that we did, it's often occurred to me that his manner of handling that was more than just a fiscal problem-solving effort. He indeed saved government in the state of New York, because government was on an edge, was closer to an edge than most people ever realized. If we had failed in the fiscal crisis 8 or 10 months into his first term as governor, the city of New York could have been governed by a federal judge. And the ability of a democracy to function would have been put at the edge, at the greatest strain that could have been imagined in this country for a state government would have occurred. That the most powerful, most glamorous, most notable city in the world would have lost its democracy because of mistakes that have been made in the past, and because of lack of good government in the past, and because of the inability of competing parties to get together. All would have been lost, with results we can't even foresee at the moment.
What qualities did Hugh Carey bring to that job?
What he brought to that job was a decisiveness that I'd never seen in public life before. Now, whether that decisiveness and that risk-taking ability came because of the enormous fear that we all had, and the fear that I know that he had of the loss of the democratic process in the city, or whether because it was inherent in him, I didn't recognize at the moment. I don't know where it had come from when I saw it. But everything that was proposed, the kinds of people that we were able to bring in, the divergent viewpoints that we could gather in order to synthesize some kind of a solution to a problem that had no precedent. All of those things were possible because of his risk-taking and the decisiveness that he brought to it. And the thing that will always stick out in my mind in that period was that there was really no idea that you could bring to him, and no person that you could bring to him that was beyond the bounds, because he knew it was unprecedented. and he was not governing himself by the traditional political rules. And that is one of the strongest attributes I think he brought to the government.
A few more years down the line, and Hugh Carey's name shows up in the newspaper and hasn't recently. You read it, and it triggers a memory.
Mm.
What do you think that memory is going to be?
Well, the memory will be something of what I just spoke about. The fiscal problem that I like to talk of in terms of saving government. But I suppose the outstanding memory, the most outstanding memory will be, as far as I'm concerned, he also saved politics. I well remember in those early days, the governor having recently lost his wife, and my family still lived downstate, and we spent many, many hours together. And it was during the course of that growing relationship that we had that a capital punishment bill was passed. Now, I've been in public life enough and around political people enough to know, in crass terms, what is in their best interest and what is not in their best interest. And clearly, in political terms, it was not in his best interest to veto a capital punishment bill. And he knew it too. The endless hours that we spent in the mansion rehashing all our Jesuitical arguments, we both knew where he was going to come out. He didn't resist coming out that way. But we argued it again and again and again, endlessly. It was a torment. And then finally, he came out where he knew he was going to come out, and I knew he was going to come out. And we wrote that veto message in an afternoon, because there was no need to spend much more time on it, since we had spent countless hours on it. And to me, that was a major step forward in saving politics. If he saved government in the fiscal crisis, he saved politics in the issue of capital punishment, because he gave it such a damn good name, that a man can stand for what he believes, can go against the tide because he feels morally bound to do so, and then eventually be rewarded for that, because I believe he was rewarded for that in his re-election campaign thereafter. More people said, despite the polls, that I